If you've ever felt like you're not as smart as others, maybe that's a good sign. Maybe real intelligence was never what they told you it was. Give me 5 minutes, and I'll prove it. They called me smart. I never believed them. Because most people don't know what intelligence is, they only know how it looks. It looks like fast answers, like using big words, like winning debates, like getting top grades. But what if all of that is just mimicry? What if the entire system is built to reward those who memorize better, conform faster, and obey more quietly? Not those who think. From childhood, I noticed something strange. The so-called smartest kids were often the most predictable. They had the answers, but not the questions. They excelled in tests, but failed at real problems. They could quote theories, but couldn't build anything. They were optimized for approval, not reality. That's not intelligence. That's a performance, a game. And the world claps for it, until it collapses. I didn't want to play that game. I wanted to understand how things work, not how they look on paper. So I asked questions that seemed stupid. Why do rockets cost so much? Why can't we live on Mars? Why do electric cars have to be ugly? And every time I'd get that look, raised eyebrows, forced smiles, the silent judgment of, you don't get it. But that's exactly the point. If I already got it, I'd just be copying. Real intelligence doesn't copy. It questions, breaks, rebuilds. You don't learn by repeating. You learn by burning down assumptions and asking, what's the raw truth underneath all this noise? Schools didn't reward that. They punished it. Try questioning the curriculum and watch how fast they label you as disruptive. Try slowing down the process to understand instead of memorize, and you'll get left behind. So people learn the script. Recite the lines, smile, nod, pass, graduate, fit in. That's not learning. That's training. Most of what society calls smart is just obedience in a nicer suit. And the cost of that illusion? It's massive. Entire industries are built by people who look competent, but build nothing. Corporations stacked with MBA degrees that can't innovate. Political systems run by speechmakers, not problem solvers. People mistake complexity for intelligence. But I've found that the deeper you go into truth, the simpler it becomes. The best engineers I've worked with aren't the ones with the fanciest vocabulary. They're the ones who ask, what are we really trying to solve here? Then they shut up and build. That's intelligence. Not showing off what you know, but admitting what you don't, and going after it with everything you've got. There's no shame in not knowing. The shame is pretending you do. So I stopped pretending. I started rebuilding my brain like a machine. Strip away what's useless. Replace it with what works. No ego. No fluff. Just functionality. I don't care how it's always been done. I care if it makes sense. Tradition is a poor excuse for stagnation. Credentials are a poor substitute for competence. Confidence is a poor mask for ignorance. And when you stop chasing the illusion of intelligence, you start building something real. Most people won't understand that. That's okay. I didn't build for them. I built for those who think like rebels, not actors. Those who are willing to look stupid for asking the right question. Those who would rather be wrong 1,000 times than pretend to be right once. If that sounds like you, keep watching. This is the mind of Musk. They think intelligence is memory, a high score, a quick answer, a long list of facts. But memory is a tape recorder. Intelligence is a weapon. Most people don't know the difference, and most systems don't want them to. Because real intelligence questions the system. Memorization protects it. Schools reward memorization. So does corporate culture. So does politics. Because it's safe, predictable, controllable. But building rockets isn't safe. Colonizing Mars isn't predictable. And changing the world isn't controllable. So I had to unlearn everything they taught me about being smart. Because it wasn't helping me build anything. It was just making me good at repeating. That's not useful. That's noise. That's compression without comprehension. And it shows. I've interviewed hundreds of engineers who looked great on paper, straight-A students, top schools, fancy degrees, but when I asked them to explain something without the textbook, they froze. Not because they were stupid, but because they'd never been forced to think, only to remember. That's not intelligence. That's intellectual karaoke. You're singing someone else's song and calling it your own. I've never cared how much someone knows. I care how they handle not knowing. What do they do when the answer isn't in the book? What happens when the blueprint fails? What do they build when they're given nothing but a blank page? That's where real thinking begins. In the void, in the friction, in the silence between what exists and what could exist. That's where intelligence lives. I once asked an engineer why the battery pack for our car cost so much. He gave me a long explanation. Terms, standards, industry averages. Basically, that's just how it is. I said, no, break it down. Atom by atom. What are the raw materials? How much are they per pound? Why are we paying $600 per kilowatt hour when the material cost is $80? He paused, then smiled, and said, I've never thought about it like that. That's the problem. No one's taught to think like that. They're taught to inherit conclusions, not construct them. They're taught to memorize the way things are, not question why they have to be. But first principles thinking doesn't care about precedent. It only cares about physics, logic, and constraints. That's why it works, and that's why it scares people. Because when you think from scratch, you expose how much of society is just copy-paste behavior. I've always found it ironic that we call it education when most of it is just downloading. Input, output, like programming a machine. But I don't need machines. I need builders, architects, systems-level thinkers, people who can start with a pile of atoms and end with a product that changes the trajectory of civilization. That doesn't come from memory. That comes from pain, from failure, from pressure, from refusing to accept the first answer just because it's the easiest. Intelligence isn't knowing what's in the book. It's knowing when to throw the book away. I've seen people with 0 credentials outperform PhDs. Why? Because they understood the problem. They didn't need permission to solve it. They didn't wait for a model. They built one. And when it broke, they built a better one. That's intelligence. Adaptive. Iterative. Ruthless. It doesn't care how clever you sound. It cares what you produce. Intelligence is what survives stress, what evolves under friction, what remains when memory fails. Because eventually, it will. The brain forgets. The market changes. The environment shifts. But if you understand the essence, you can rebuild from scratch. Again and again. That's how you stay ahead. Not by remembering faster, but by forgetting better. People ask me why I push teams so hard, why I question everything, why I ignore credentials, why I force people to explain like they're talking to a 5-year-old. It's simple. If you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it. And if you don't understand it, you can't build it. And if you can't build it, why are you even here? This isn't school. This is SpaceX. This is Tesla. This is Mars. The cost of fake intelligence is too high here. It kills missions. It burns millions. It gets people killed. So I don't reward memory. I reward clarity, depth, honesty, intellectual humility. Because intelligence isn't how smart you look in a meeting. It's what you can do when everything breaks, when the manual's gone, when the simulation crashes, when it's just you, a problem, and the question, what now? That's where the thinkers rise, and the memorizers disappear. If you've ever felt like you're not book smart, good. Maybe you were never meant to repeat. Maybe you were meant to rebuild. If that's you, keep watching. The world doesn't punish stupidity. It punishes the appearance of stupidity. That's why most people spend their lives pretending to be smart. They memorize just enough to survive meetings. They nod at the right time, ask the safe questions, echo what's already been said, just with slightly better vocabulary, and they think that's intelligence. It's not. It's self-preservation. It's social camouflage, and it's everywhere. I've seen it infect engineering teams, entire rooms full of people pretending to understand, afraid to speak up, afraid to ask the obvious question, because no one wants to be the idiot who slows things down. But that silence, that fear, is exactly what slows everything down. Not the question, not the flaw, the fear of surfacing it. That's what kills companies. That's what explodes rockets. That's what creates disasters that no one saw coming, even though someone did. Quietly, silently, months before. I don't care how smart you look. I care how much truth you can surface when it's unpopular, because in every failure I've ever studied, whether it's a business collapse or a structural implosion, there was always someone who knew. But they didn't say it, because they didn't want to look dumb. So they pretended. And the system rewarded that. It still does. Schools teach it early. You get punished for being wrong in public. You get labeled as disruptive for questioning the material. You learn fast. Don't ask. Just memorize. Just pass. Just move on. Corporations amplify it. Middle managers performing competence. Leaders reading from scripts. Executives who'd rather sound confident than admit, I don't know. And the tragedy? Most of them really don't know. They're just better at hiding it. And when hiding becomes the norm, disaster becomes inevitable. Because reality doesn't care how smart you look. It only cares whether you solve the problem. I remember in the early days of SpaceX, we had an engine issue that no one wanted to escalate. It looked small. The math said it was okay. But one of our younger engineers kept asking, why does the vibration feel wrong? He was ignored because he didn't have the right title, the right confidence, the right tone. So we kept going, and the engine failed on launch. Millions lost. Mission compromised. Not because we didn't have the intelligence, but because we didn't reward it when it didn't perform well socially. After that, I made it very clear. I'd rather have a team that looks dumb and asks everything than a team that looks brilliant and says nothing. Because fake intelligence is expensive. It wastes time. It wastes trust. It builds castles on sand. And worst of all, it replicates itself. Smart-acting people hire smart-acting people, and soon you have an organization optimized for looking right instead of being right. That's how empires rot from within. Not through enemies, through ego. And the biggest ego of all is the one that says, I can't be seen as wrong. But the people I trust most are the ones who say, I might be wrong, but here's what I see. That's courage. That's value. That's the root of real progress. Because if you can't speak the flaw, you can't fix the flaw. And if you can't fix the flaw, it will fix you. Usually at the worst possible time. We live in a culture obsessed with optics, interviews, credentials, confidence. We hire people based on how well they perform intelligence, not how well they build, not how deep they think, not how brutally honest they are under pressure. And then we wonder why things fall apart, why the product sucks, why innovation stalls. It's not because people weren't smart. It's because too many of them were pretending to be. And pretending has a cost. It's subtle at first, a delay, a missed insight, a safety margin pushed just a little too far. But it adds up. And when it breaks hard. That's why I tell my teams, don't be afraid to look dumb. Be afraid of being fake. I'll fire the smartest person in the room if they hide what they know, and I'll promote the one who admits what they don't, because that's the person who'll actually grow. Intelligence isn't a performance. It's a process. And pretending stops that process cold. If you're in a room full of people and no one is saying anything that makes them vulnerable, get out. That room is dead. Nothing new will come from it. No truth, no breakthrough, just safe words and slow death. I've made peace with being wrong, with asking the stupid question, with looking like the idiot, because I've seen what happens when no one does, and I never want to watch that movie again. I've asked a lot of questions that made people uncomfortable, not because they were offensive, but because they sounded stupid, because they exposed something people didn't want to admit, that they didn't really know what they were doing. Most systems are built on layers of assumptions. Assumptions no one questions, because questioning them makes you look like you weren't paying attention. Or worse, like you're dumb. But I'd rather look dumb for 5 minutes than be wrong for 5 years. That's why I ask the questions no one else wants to ask. Why is that part there? Why can't it be removed? Why do we need this process at all? The moment you ask, people flinch. They scramble to defend what they've never examined. Well, that's the standard. That's how we've always done it. Everyone does it this way. None of those are answers. They're habits wearing the mask of logic. They're echoes from someone else's brain. But I don't want echoes. I want roots. I want atomic truths. Things that remain true even when everything else changes. That's why I dig. That's why I ask. Even if the question sounds idiotic. Because behind every stupid question is a deeper question. Is this real, or are we all pretending? I once asked our rocket team why we couldn't land a booster instead of letting it crash into the ocean. They laughed, then paused, then said, "Well, we've never tried." So we tried, and we failed, and failed, and failed again. And then we landed it. Now it's standard practice, because someone dared to ask the question that sounded stupid, until it wasn't. That's how progress works. The frontier of innovation always looks like ignorance to people trapped in convention. If the question doesn't scare you a little, it's probably not deep enough. If it doesn't make people shift in their seats, it's probably not breaking new ground. People don't fear bad questions. They fear questions that reveal their knowledge is shallow, that their expertise is inherited, not earned, that their systems are built on inertia, not understanding, and when that fear shows up, it always looks the same. Laughter, deflection, silence. I've learned to pay attention to those reactions, because that's where the real tension is. That's where the bottlenecks hide, not in the code, not in the equations, in the assumptions. The things we stopped questioning a long time ago because they became too sacred to touch. But nothing is sacred to physics. Nothing is sacred to reality. You can believe you're right. You can convince a room. You can even win an argument. But if your assumptions are wrong, reality will break you quietly, brutally, and without apology. That's why I ask what sounds stupid. Because I don't care about being clever. I care about being correct. I care about what works. I care about building something that survives contact with the real world. Not a whiteboard, not a pitch deck, not a TED Talk. The real world. And the real world doesn't reward performance. It rewards clarity. Questions are how you get there. Not the flashy ones, not the impressive ones, the basic ones, the obvious ones. The ones people stopped asking because they were told not to. Why? Why not? What if we're wrong? Those are the tools. That's the work. And if you're not willing to look like an idiot sometimes, you'll never build anything that matters. I've been in rooms where the most valuable insight came from the intern who didn't know she wasn't allowed to ask. I've seen million-dollar errors caught by someone who hadn't learned to be afraid yet. That's the irony. The longer you're in a system, the harder it is to question it. You get too good at playing the role, too fluent in the rules, too comfortable with being right. That's when you start losing. That's when you start protecting the system instead of improving it. So I stay naive on purpose. I assume nothing. I challenge everything. Not because I enjoy it, but because it's the only way to build something that deserves to exist. And every time I ask a stupid question, I learn something real. even if the answer is obvious, even if the reaction is awkward. Because one day, that awkward moment might save the mission, or the company, or a life. Ask, even if it makes people squirm. Especially if it makes people squirm. That's where the truth starts. It's not enough to be smart. You have to make intelligence scale. One brilliant mind can only solve so many problems. But a system built to think, that can solve anything. That's why I never cared about how smart one person is. I care how well they transfer that thinking into teams, into culture, into code, into machines. That's what matters. Because lone genius doesn't build rockets. Systems do. And systems are only as good as the thinking embedded in them. The problem is, most organizations scale obedience, not intelligence. They create SOPs, not frameworks. They train people to follow, not to think. So the more they grow, the dumber they get. More people, less clarity, more process, less insight. And eventually you end up with a giant machine no one understands, doing things no one questions, producing results no one can fix. I've seen it. I've dismantled it. I've refused to let it happen in anything I build. That's why I push my teams to operate from first principles. Not because it's clever, but because it forces understanding. You can't copy your way to truth. You have to reduce. Break the problem into atoms. Understand every constraint, every assumption, every trade-off, and then rebuild from the ground up. That kind of thinking is slow at first, but it scales. Because once one person thinks that way, they can teach 10 others, and those 10 can teach 100. But only if the thinking is clean, transferable, modular, like code. I've fired people who were individually brilliant but couldn't explain their reasoning, because if your knowledge can't move through the system, it dies with you. That's ego, not intelligence. Real intelligence is shareable. It's explainable. It's teachable. That's why I force engineers to explain their work like they're talking to a child. Not to dumb it down, but to clean it up. If you can't make it simple, you don't understand it. And if you don't understand it, you can't scale it. Every company I've built has been an experiment in intellectual transmission. How do we embed clear thinking into product design, into hiring, into manufacturing, into how we talk to customers? It's not about adding more minds. It's about aligning them. If 100 people move in 100 directions, you go nowhere. If 100 people apply the same mental model to different problems, you move fast. That's why I don't optimize for talent. I optimize for architecture. What thinking model is this company built on? Can it adapt? Can it detect error? Can it improve itself without waiting for a genius to intervene? That's the point. To build something that gets smarter without you. Something that learns. Not just individuals, but the system itself. I've seen teams solve problems I couldn't, not because they were smarter, but because we shared the same model, same rules, same ruthless pursuit of truth over optics. When everyone's aligned on that, you don't need approval. You don't need permission. People just move, build, fix, improve. That's intelligence at scale. Not one person thinking fast, but thousands thinking clearly. Most companies never get there. They confuse process with thinking, meetings with clarity, confidence with insight. So they reward noise, presentation, politics, and by the time they realize the system doesn't work, it's too big to change. That's why I build thinking into the foundation. From day one, from the first hire, from the first line of code. Because culture isn't what you say, it's what your system rewards. And if your system rewards performative intelligence, that's what you'll get. People who sound smart, look smart, but build nothing. Intelligence that scales doesn't look like that. It looks like friction, like argument, like someone in the corner saying, "This doesn't make sense." It looks like questions asked for the 10th time until the answer is clean. It looks like slowing down when everyone else wants to move fast. Because the problem hasn't been understood yet. It looks like obsession with the model, not the meeting, with the mechanism, not the headline. That's how you build a company that outlives its founders, a product that survives market shocks, a culture that corrects itself. Intelligence that scales doesn't worship IQ. It worships clarity, honesty, transferability. Not how much one brain knows, but how many brains it can teach. That's what I'm building. Not brilliance, architecture. Most people don't realize their mind is running someone else's code. Installed by school, reinforced by media, protected by fear. They think they're thinking, but they're executing scripts, habits, beliefs, none of which they wrote. And most of it isn't built to solve problems. It's built to avoid discomfort. So when the world breaks, their code crashes. Because it was never meant to face reality, just to survive it. I had to unlearn that code, rip it out. Line by line, subroutine by subroutine. Everything I thought was true, I had to test it. Why do I believe this? Where did it come from? What happens if I break it? That's how I rebuilt my brain, like an operating system, not a collection of facts, a set of functions, a way of processing the unknown. The default human OS is built for approval, repetition, shortcuts. It optimizes for looking right, not being right. But I needed something else, something that could handle zero gravity, empty bank accounts, rockets exploding, governments resisting, everything failing at once. I needed an OS that wouldn't panic, that wouldn't freeze, that would get better as pressure increased. So I wrote one, principle by principle, function by function. Here's what it runs on. First, assume nothing, no matter how obvious. If I can't explain it from first principles, I don't know it. Second, bias for clarity, not speed. If it's not clear, it's wrong. I don't care how fast you move. Third, reality is the benchmark, not opinion, not consensus. Physics doesn't care if you agree. It just is. Fourth, simplicity scales, complexity breaks. The deeper the truth, the simpler it gets. If it's convoluted, it's probably hiding a lie. Fifth, debug emotions. Most failures aren't technical, they're emotional. Pride, fear, insecurity. If I don't spot it, it infects the code. Sixth, test under pressure. If it only works when things are perfect, it doesn't work. The system must improve under stress. Seventh, ship, then iterate. Perfection is paralysis. Launch. Watch it break. Fix what matters. Iterate again. Eighth, explain like I'm 5. If I can't teach it simply, I don't understand it deeply. Ninth, truth, image, always, even if it hurts, even if it costs, even if it breaks the story I want to tell, especially then. 10th, fire ego on sight. Ego is a virus. It corrupts judgment. It resists truth. It cares more about being right than solving the problem. I kill it every day. This is the OS I run. It's not perfect, but it's mine. It doesn't flinch. It doesn't lie to me. It doesn't collapse under pressure. It learns. It adapts. And it never protects my feelings at the cost of truth. Most people won't install it. It's too uncomfortable. Too slow at first. Too painful. But if you're building something that matters, something that can't afford to crash, then you can't use the same mental software as everyone else. You need to rebuild from the metal. No GUI, no fluff, just a terminal, a blank screen, and a question. Does this actually make sense? That's where it begins. The rebuild. Not with more knowledge, but with cleaner logic, fewer assumptions, higher stress tolerance, less ego, more reality. That's not a mindset. That's infrastructure. That's architecture. That's the kind of intelligence that doesn't just win arguments. It lands rockets. It bends markets. It changes trajectories, not once, but repeatedly. Under pressure. Without fail. That's what I trust. That's what I build. Most people won't do it. They'll keep running the old code, keep playing smart, keep optimizing for applause. And when the system crashes, they'll blame the system, not the software inside their own heads. But if you're still here, if this didn't just make sense but hit something deeper, then maybe your OS is already updating. Let it finish. And if you want to go further, we're not done. The next video breaks the most dangerous myth in modern thinking. Why waiting feels smart, but kills everything. You're watching Mind of Musk. This is where systems break, rebuild, and go orbital.